I have never been paranoid. Julia was always honest with me. She often worked late or went to fitness after work. I trusted her until one evening, while charging her phone, I saw a pop-up message. Meet me tomorrow at 7:34 Lincoln Street. The usual. I just stood there and looked at the screen. Then I locked the phone and put it on the nightstand as if nothing had happened. The next day I took the day off and rented an apartment in the building across the street from 34 Lincoln Street. She said she was going to go to a fitness class at 6:30. I waited by the window with a cup of cold coffee in my hand. At 6:55, I saw Julia get out of her car and quickly enter the building. She looked back twice, as if she was afraid of being followed. 2 hours later, she came out. She was holding a bag with a bottle of wine. I came out of the entrance almost close to her. She froze when she saw me. "How was your training?" She exhaled sharply and looked at me as if I were a ghost. "Nick. What are you doing here?" I took the papers out of my pocket and handed them to her. "This is what I do." Julia took the papers without even opening them. I can explain." "No need." I turned and walked to the car, feeling her eyes drilling into my back. At home, I went to sleep on the couch for the first time in years. Max, our Labrador, lay down next to me and put his head on my lap. She came back late at night, but did not come into the bedroom. The next morning I woke up before her. Julia was sleeping in the guest room. The door was open and I could see her across the hall. She was lying still, but I knew she hadn't slept all night. Max followed me into the kitchen, his tail barely moving. He sat down silently by the bowl and waited. "Be right there, buddy." While the coffee was boiling, I threw him the food and sat down at the table. On the table were the same documents I had given Julia. She never signed them. While I was drinking coffee, I heard footsteps. Julia walked into the kitchen, looking like it was physically painful for her to be here. "Good morning," she said quietly. I didn't answer. She sat down across from me, looking at me, but I didn't look up. "Nick." I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't." She closed her eyes and held her breath for a second. "I'm sorry." "So am I." The kitchen was filled with silence. Max lay down at my feet again, as if he felt tense. Julia got up first. "I'll pick up the stuff after work." I nodded without even looking at her. The door closed, and I was left alone with my cold coffee. Max looked up, expecting something. "Shall we go for a walk, boy?" He happily jumped to his feet, as if he had been waiting for this. We wandered around the park for a long time. I let Max walk ahead of me, just watching him. When we got home, the house was empty. Her things were gone. Max ran into the house first and stopped in the middle of the living room as if something was wrong. I took off my jacket, threw it on the armchair and slowly walked into the bedroom. The dressing room was half empty. Julia had taken her things, but a few dresses were still hanging in the far corner. I ran my hand over the fabric, feeling something heavy in my chest as I touched them. On the nightstand was her favorite book, the one I had given her on our second anniversary. I picked it up, turned a few pages, and left it where it was. Max lay down by the bed and raised his head, watching me. "She's not coming back, man." I sat down next to him with my arms around his neck, and he put his head on my lap. The day passed in a blur. I found myself walking from room to room, as if looking for something that didn't exist. I didn't feel like eating dinner, so I poured myself some whiskey and sat on the terrace, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. Julia texted me late in the evening. "I forgot a few things in the bathroom. I'll pick them up tomorrow afternoon. I hope you don't mind." I read the message several times and left it unanswered. The next day I woke up to Max barking at the door. Julia was standing on the threshold, holding the key in her hand. "I thought you wouldn't be home. Max quickly made it clear that you were here." She walked into the house without looking at me. Max spun around as if he couldn't figure out whether to be happy or not. I stood in the doorway, watching her silently gather the things she had left behind. She was in no hurry. When Julia packed the last box, she stopped for a second in the living room. "You're holding up well." I didn't say anything. She looked at Max, who sat down next to me. "Take care of him. He's staying with me." Julia nodded as if she expected nothing more and walked to the door. Max followed her with his eyes until the door closed. For a few minutes I just stood there, listening to her footsteps retreating down the path. Max lay down again by the front door. I sat down on the floor next to him and ran my hand through his fur. "Just you and me, boy." Max lifted his head and licked my hand as if in agreement. The next morning I woke up to Max gently nudging me with his nose. It was already dawn outside, but the house was quieter than ever. Julia had left the key on the kitchen table. It was where she always left it after work. I picked it up, twirled it around a bit, and put it in the drawer with the other little things. "Well, Max, shall we start again?" He wagged his tail and went to the door, hinting at a walk. As we walked along the forest path along the lake, I felt my head gradually clear. The sun was rising above the trees, the air was fresh, and even Max seemed to feel that something had changed. I decided to go to the city. I didn't have a specific goal, I just wanted to be among people. Max was sitting in the front seat with his head out the open window. The city was going about its life as usual. I stopped at a coffee shop where Julia and I used to have breakfast often. "Do you think this is a good idea?" I asked Max. He looked at me and just yawned. When I went inside, I heard a familiar voice. "Nick?" I looked up. Lori, Julia's old friend, was sitting by the window with her laptop. "Hi," I smiled a little awkwardly. "Sit down if you have time." I sat down across from her, and Max lay down under the table. "How are you?" "I'm fine. I'm learning to live again." Lori nodded, her lips curling slightly. "Julia said you two are separated now." "Yeah." We were silent for a few minutes until the waitress brought coffee. "To be honest," Lori said, "I didn't think you'd get a divorce." "Neither did I." Lori looked at me again. "But maybe it's for the best." I met her gaze and nodded unexpectedly. "Probably." Max looked up when he heard the waitress put a bowl of water in front of him. "Will you be here for long?" Lori asked. "I'll see." She smiled. "Come in if you need anything. My friends and I often get together here on weekends." I took the business card she handed me and stuck it in my jacket pocket. "I'll definitely come by." Max sighed heavily and lay down, going back to sleep. When I left the coffee shop, my heart felt a little lighter. Maybe it was really the beginning of something new. The next day I returned to the same coffee shop. Max immediately settled under the table as if it were his permanent place. I ordered a coffee and a croissant and watched the people passing by the window. Lori was there again. This time she was sitting in the company of two women and laughing out loud at some joke. She noticed me and waved her hand, indicating that I should come over. "Nick, these are my friends, Sarah and Jessica. Girls, this is Nick." I nodded to them and sat down at the next table. "How often do you guys come here?" I asked, stirring sugar into my coffee. "Almost every morning." "Julia never told you?" I smiled slightly. "No, I don't think she ever mentioned it." Sarah, a blonde with a short haircut, leaned closer. "Julia didn't tell me much at all." Lori looked at her with an expression that told her to shut up, but I already understood. "It's okay," I said. I didn't expect anything else. We talked some more, and I learned that Lori worked nearby, and Sarah and Jessica had opened a small decorating store a few blocks away. When they were about to leave, Lori stopped by my desk. "Are you sure you're okay?" "Yes," I answered. "Even better than I thought." She stood there for a moment, as if she wanted to say something else, but instead she just smiled. "Well, come back often." "I will." When I left the coffee shop, Max was clapping his paws hard on the sidewalk. "What do you think, Max? It seems like life is getting better." He just lifted his head, licked his nose, and ran to the car. On the way home, I stopped at the same decor store. There was a sign on the window that said, "Open." Sarah was standing behind the counter talking to a customer. She saw me and smiled. "Well, now we know for sure that you didn't run away." "Yeah, I just thought I'd come by and see what you had. Lori will be happy to see you again." I looked at a few things, picked up a small lantern for the terrace, and went to the cash register. "Something's changed since, you know." "Julia?" she asked as she punched in the purchase. I thought about it for a while. "I guess it did. I just don't wait for things to happen anymore." Sarah nodded. "That's good." When I got home, Max immediately lay down by the terrace. I hung up the lantern and sat down next to him, listening to the wind rustle softly in the leaves. The next week I went to the decor store again. This time Lori was behind the counter. She smiled when I walked in. "I didn't think I'd see you so soon." I decided to add some more light to the terrace. I picked up a small set of lanterns. "I guess you're an official customer now," Lori joked as she punched in the purchase. Max, as usual, was lying by the door, watching the passers-by. "What's new with you guys?" I asked while she was packing up the flashlights. "Sarah wants to expand the store. She says there's a lack of places in town where people can just gather and drink coffee." That's a good idea. You know Sarah, she's always coming up with ideas. But she doesn't have enough people to help with the repairs. I put the box on the counter and raised my eyebrows. "If something needs to be built or repaired, I can help. I have a lot of free time." Lori thought about it. "You mean you're serious?" "Why not? Listen, that would be great. Let me tell Sarah and we'll figure something out." We talked some more, and when I walked out, Max stood up immediately, ready to go to the car. "Looks like we're going to have a new project, man." Max just wagged his tail. The next day I met Sarah at the store. She was already waiting with a tape measure in her hand. "Are you sure you're interested?" she asked as I examined the old wooden beams under the roof. "Absolutely. Besides, I need something to do while Max is off looking for adventure." Max lay down in the corner and yawned. "Okay," Sarah said, "let's start by painting the walls." We worked for several hours. Lori brought coffee and pizza, and the day went by faster than I expected. As we were finishing painting, Sarah stopped next to me and asked, "You know, you've changed." "In what way?" "For the better." I didn't answer, just smiled and went to wash the paint off my hands. Max was running around the shop while we were putting away the tools. Lori looked up. "You're almost like a part of our team." "Maybe I am." Max barked as if in agreement. When we were done, I sat on the terrace outside the store, watching the evening envelop the city. Lori sat down next to me. "What's next, Nick?" "I don't know. But I like to take my time." She nodded and looked at Max, who was already dozing under the terrace. It looked like it suited Max, too. I stayed sitting until darkness completely covered the city. A few weeks later, Sarah and I finished working on the store. The renovated facade, wooden shelves, and new lamps made the place more cozy. Max was around almost all the time, and Ruby, who was now brought by Emma more often, also became part of the construction company. One morning, when I stopped by to check the paint on the walls, Lori was sitting on the windowsill with a coffee, talking to Sarah. "Nick." "Just in time," Sarah said, waving at me. "What's up?" Lori put down her cup and looked at me. "We've decided to have a party to celebrate the opening. And you're not going to get out of it." I laughed. "A party? Are you sure this is necessary?" Sarah crossed her arms over her chest. "Absolutely. You helped, so you should be a part of it." I sighed and sat down next to her. Max lay down at my feet, as usual. "Max, okay. When is it going to be?" Lori looked at Sarah. "Saturday night. There will be a few people, some wine, and lots of music." On Saturday night, the town seemed even quieter than usual. The store was lit up with lights, and several tables with snacks were set up in the yard. People gradually gathered, and Max, like a real host, greeted each guest. Emma showed up closer to sunset. She brought homemade pies and immediately joined the crowd, laughing with Lori and Sarah. I stood a little to the side, watching everything, until I felt a light nudge on my shoulder. "Are you hiding?" Emma was standing next to me with a glass of wine. "No, just watching." She smiled and looked at the people. "It turned out beautifully. Sarah said it wouldn't have happened without you." "They're exaggerating." "I don't think so." We stood there listening to someone tune a guitar in the corner of the yard. "You know, Nick, I'm glad you stayed here." I looked at her. "Me too." Emma sat a little closer on the bench next to me. Max laid down at her feet, and Ruby settled down by the pie table. The evening dragged on slowly, like everything else in this place. People were leaving around midnight, leaving behind a light noise and the smell of wine. When Emma and I were almost alone, she looked at me. "What's next?" I shrugged my shoulders. "I guess it's up to us." She smiled and lightly touched my hand. "Maybe it's time for us to think about the boat." Max raised his head, hearing the familiar word, and lay back down again, sighing contentedly. I guess he didn't mind. The next morning, I woke up to Max hanging around the door. Emma was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket on the couch. The party had gone on long enough that we decided to stay in the store to clean up in the morning. I opened the door, and Max immediately ran outside, stopping at a small pile of boxes left over from yesterday's deliveries. The sun was just rising, and the street was quiet. The city was waking up slowly, as usual. I went back inside and started to put together the tables that were left in the yard. "Aren't you making too much noise in there?" I heard a sleepy Emma from behind me. She stretched and walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Someone has to clean up after yesterday's party." "I can join in, but only after my second cup of coffee," she said, sitting down on the terrace steps. Max ran over and sat down next to her, putting his head in her lap. "You seem to be okay living in the store, too," she stroked his ear. "He's just happy to be where we are." Emma smiled. "It's becoming a habit." We finished cleaning up around lunchtime. Sarah showed up with 2 bottles of lemonade and Lori brought cookies. "How do you feel after the holiday?" Lori asked, sitting down next to me. "I feel like I'm alive for the first time in a long time." Lori nodded and looked over to Emma, who was talking to Sarah. "She thinks so too." I didn't answer, but it was true. A week later, Emma and I finally decided to buy a boat. It was an old wooden boat sold by a local fisherman. It needed repairs, but I saw the potential in it. "Do you think we can handle it?" Emma asked as we pulled it to the shore. "We managed the store, we can handle this." Max was running around sniffing every plank, as if he was checking to see if this boat was worth trusting. Ruby lay in the shade of a tree, watching everything with indifference. "Do you think we'll go out every weekend?" Emma asked, sitting down on the sand. I think it will become our new ritual. She tossed her hair back and looked at me. And that's a good thing. Max jumped into the boat, and it bobbed on the water. He's already taken the captain's seat, Emma laughed. So we'll have a Captain Max. The sun began to hide behind the trees, and the water on the lake reflected the evening sky. We sat on the shore, listening to the water lapping softly against the boat, and it was better than any words. Repairing the boat took longer than I expected. I spent almost every evening after work on the shore, fixing the boards and sanding the wooden planking. Emma often sat next to me, sometimes holding a lantern or just silently watching me work. Max, as usual, lay down on the bow of the boat, as if controlling the process. Ruby stayed on the shore, sitting in the shade of the trees and occasionally barking at the seagulls. One evening, when I was finishing painting the sides, Emma came closer and sat down next to me. You know, she said, holding a can of paint in her hands, I didn't think you were really going to finish it. Sometimes I thought so too. I put the brush down and looked at the boat. It finally looked almost finished. I think you're not just fixing the boat, Emma said quietly, looking out at the lake. Maybe I am. I felt like I was completing a stage in my life with this boat, but I didn't want to say it out loud. When are we going to launch it? She asked, changing the subject. Tomorrow. We need to let the paint dry. Emma nodded and stood up. Good. I'll get the champagne. We have to celebrate our first time at sea somehow. Lake, I corrected, laughing. For me, it's the sea, she replied, walking toward the house. The next morning, Max woke me up earlier than usual. Emma was already waiting on the beach. She was sitting on the sand with 2 glasses and a bottle of champagne. Ruby was sleeping next to me, curled up in a ball. Are you always this serious about launching a boat? I asked as I walked down to the water with Max. This is a special day. I pulled the boat out and slowly launched it. Max immediately jumped in, and Emma handed me the oars. Are you ready? Yeah. She sat down next to me, and I pushed off from the shore. We sailed in silence, listening to the oars cut through the water. The lake was calm, and a light breeze swayed the grass on the shore only slightly. Max was lying on the bow of the boat, his eyes closed, as if he was enjoying the journey. Look, Emma said, pointing ahead. Not far away, a pair of swans were swimming on the water. They were moving slowly, not paying attention to us. A good sign, she said, opening the champagne. The bottle popped quietly, and we filled our glasses. To new beginnings, Emma toasted. I looked at the boat, at the lake, at Max, who was already snoring, and realized that this was indeed a new beginning. To new beginnings, I repeated, clinking her glass. The boat rocked slowly on the waves, and it seemed to me that everything would be exactly as it should be. The next few weeks became a real tradition for us. Every morning, Max was already sitting by the boat, as if to remind us that it was time to get out on the water. Ruby would join us, but kept her distance. She liked to watch us sail away, staying on the shore and meeting us when we returned. Once we reached the middle of the lake, Emma pulled a map out of her backpack. What's this? I asked, lowering my paddles. I was researching old routes. Look, there are a few places nearby where we can set up camp. She unfolded the map on the bench between us. Do you want to go camping? Emma smiled. Why not? Summer will be over soon. I glanced at Max, who was lying on the bow of the boat, his tail lazily slapping the wood. I think he won't mind. We decided to go the next weekend. Emma spent the whole week packing our gear, and I cleaned up the boat. Max ran around the yard while we packed our bags, and Ruby just watched from the shade of the porch. Do you think Ruby will stay home? Emma asked as we packed our sleeping bags. She doesn't like the water. But I'll leave the porch open for her. In the morning we set off. The boat was loaded to the brim with a tent, sleeping bags, and a camping pot. Max was sitting in the middle, paws carefully positioned, as if he was afraid of hitting things. Ruby was watching us from the shore. "She's going to be offended," Emma said as we sailed away. "She'll forgive us when we come back with presents." We sailed for several hours until we found a bay with a small beach. The forest came right up to the shore, and the place was perfect for camping. Emma set up a tent and I made a fire. Max carried the firewood and enthusiastically helped, in his own way. We sat by the fire until evening, listening to the darkness envelop the forest. "You haven't had a vacation like this in a long time," Emma said, sitting comfortably in the blanket. I looked at the lake, which reflected the stars. "Probably not." Max lay down between us, tired after an active day, and fell asleep with his paws warmed by the fire. Emma took my hand. "I think we should get out like this more often." I squeezed her fingers and nodded. "I think you're right." This silence, the lake, the forest, and the night, everything felt right. In the morning, we were woken up by the sun breaking through the leaves. Max was the first to get out of the tent and immediately ran to the water. Emma was sitting by the fire making coffee. "Good morning," she said, handing me a cup. I sat down next to her and felt a wave of peace wash over me. Life was making sense again, but this time it was from simple things. The next week after the camping went by unnoticed. Max was constantly running to the boat, as if hinting that we should go on another trip. Ruby went out with Emma more often now, but still stayed closer to home, guarding the yard. One morning, while I was drinking coffee on the terrace, Emma came out with her phone in her hand and a thoughtful expression on her face. Had something happened? She stopped at the railing and looked out at the lake. Laurie called. "She and Sarah want to organize a festival by the lake." I set my cup down. "A festival?" "A small one, music, food, local craftsmen. Something for everyone who lives here." Max looked up, hearing Emma say the words with enthusiasm. "And they want us to help?" "I think Laurie has already decided for us." I laughed. "Of course." The next few days we all gathered at Sarah's store. Laurie was handing out assignments, and Max and Ruby were sitting in the yard, watching with great interest. "Are you going to do the stage?" Laurie asked, handing me a list. "Did anyone ask my opinion?" "No," she laughed. Emma was in charge of lighting and decor. We worked all day long preparing the space by the lake for the festival. When everything was almost ready, we gathered on the shore in the evening, watching the lanterns reflect in the dark water. "Do you think many people will come?" Emma asked, sitting down on the sand next to me. "I think more than we expect." Max lay between us, listening to the small fire crackle. "Even if he doesn't come," she said, leaning closer, "it's still a good idea." I put my arm around her shoulders. "Yes, it is. And it's going to be a good evening." The festival brought together almost everyone in our town. The kids were running around by the water, Max was running around among the guests, and Ruby was lying in the shade near the stage, keeping order, as usual. Emma and Laurie were handing out lemonade, and Sarah was leading workshops for the children. When evening fell, I was standing on the stage, setting up the last lights. Emma came over and stood next to me. "It's a beautiful day," she said, watching the lights come on along the shore. "It is." The music played softly, and people stayed on the beach long after the sun went down. Emma took my hand. "Have you noticed how things have changed in these few months?" I nodded, looking at the lake that had become part of our new life. And this was only the beginning. Max laid down at our feet, resuming his usual position. The evening seemed perfect, and I knew this place had become our home. The festival was over, but its echoes were still hovering around for a long time. For days after the event, people stopped by Sarah's shop to thank her for organizing it. It felt like something had changed, as if the town had become a little closer, more dear. Emma often stayed in the store with Lori, helping her with the new batch of goods. Max and Ruby were always around. I also stayed in town more and more often, working on small orders or fixing things in Tom's workshop. One morning, while I was drinking coffee on the terrace, Emma came out with a tablet in her hand. "I have an idea," she said, sitting down next to me. "You're always with ideas. What is it this time?" She turned the tablet toward me. On the screen was a photo of a small coffee shop by the water. Lori said that this place was up for sale. I looked at the photo carefully. "And you want to buy it?" Emma shrugged her shoulders. "It's just an idea. But Lori and I thought we could do something special here." I leaned back and thought about it. "Do you think it's risky?" "All life is risky. But I feel that this is what we need." Max came over and put his head on my lap, as if to support her idea. "All right, then. Let's check out this place." The next day, we met with the agent and went to the inspection. The coffee shop stood on a small hill overlooking the lake. It was empty inside, but you could feel the atmosphere of the past years: wooden chairs, a bar with a worn surface, old lamps. Emma walked around the room and stopped at a large panoramic window. "This will be perfect. There will be a lot of work here." She turned around and smiled. "We made it through the boat. And with the festival. I think we can handle this, too." Max and Ruby were already exploring the yard behind the building. I looked out at the lake and thought she was right, as always. A week later, we signed the documents. The coffee shop became ours. Emma and I started by renovating the place, painting the walls, fixing the furniture, installing new shelves. Max and Ruby were always around, as if they understood the importance of this business. One evening, when we were wrapping up work for the day, Emma stood on the stairs and looked out at the lake. "Do you think we can turn this into something special?" I stood next to her. We had already done that. She took my hand, and we watched in silence as the sun slowly sank below the horizon. We didn't know what was going to happen next. But it didn't matter anymore. The coffee shop came to life slowly but surely. We worked there almost every day, from dawn to dusk. Emma was engaged in interior design, finding old furniture at flea markets, which we restored together. Max was always hanging around the entrance, meeting everyone who came in to see how things were going. Ruby kept in the shadows, always nearby, as if she was guarding the peace of the place. One evening, as I was repairing a chair at the bar, Emma sat down next to me with a glass of wine. Lori said she wanted to organize an exhibition in our coffee shop after we opened. "An exhibition?" "Yes, of local artists. She thinks it will help attract attention." I nodded, focusing on my work. "It's a great idea. This place needs to be more than just a coffee shop." Emma smiled as she looked at the space we had almost completed. "I think it's already become something more." Max lifted his head as if to acknowledge her words. A month later, we opened the doors. No pomp, just put up the "open" sign and made the first cups of coffee. Lori and Sarah were among the first guests. They were sitting by a large window overlooking the lake. "You made it," Lori said, lifting her cup. "Yes," Emma replied, "but this is just the beginning." The town slowly learned about the new coffee shop. First, friends came in, then friends of friends. Later, strangers came in. One morning, I went out on the terrace holding a cup of coffee and saw Max playing with some children who had come with their parents. Ruby was watching from a distance, but did not go far. Emma was standing at the bar talking to an elderly couple. I stopped and for a second felt something turn inside me. This place became a part of us. It breathed our peace and warmth. One evening, when we were closing the coffee shop, Emma stopped at the door, looking out at the lake. "You know, I think I've found my place." I put the keys on the shelf and put my arm around her. I did the same. Max lay down at our feet, and Ruby snuggled up next to us. The lake sparkled softly in the lantern light, and I realized that I didn't need to look for anything else. We were already home. Summer was slowly turning into fall. The coffee shop gradually became a place where everyone gathered, from local fishermen to tourists who happened to find our terrace on the lake. Max became the main star. Children reached out to him with candy, and he sat patiently at the tables, watching everything with the dignity of a true master. Ruby, as always, stayed closer to Emma, occasionally disappearing into the woods behind the coffee shop. One evening, when the terrace was almost empty, Lori stayed after closing time. "Do you realize you've created something special?" she said, looking around the room. Emma leaned on the bar, wiping her cup. "We just wanted a quiet place for ourselves. It's places like this that become special." Lori took a sip of wine and looked at me. "Nick, do you feel that way too?" I nodded. "It's good here. It's good enough for me." Emma smiled as Max lay down by the crackling fireplace in the corner. He did, too. The next morning I woke up before anyone else. Emma was still asleep, wrapped in a blanket, and Max and Ruby were lying by the door. I went out to the terrace with a cup of coffee and sat on the steps, watching the fog slowly rise over the lake. A few minutes later, Ruby joined me. She sat down next to me, leaning carefully against my shoulder. "What, Ruby, did you wake up earlier than everyone else?" She sighed softly, and we sat there while the sun slowly rose above the trees. Emma came out a little later, wrapped in a blanket. "Have you been here all night?" "No, I just woke up early." She sat down next to me and put her head on my shoulder. "Do you feel how quiet it is here?" "Yeah. And I like it." Max, hearing our voices, lazily got up, stretched, and headed for the water. "I think he's already planning a new adventure," Emma said, watching him. "Or maybe he's just looking for a stick." We laughed. That day I realized we didn't need plans anymore. This house, the lake, and even the boat bobbing off the shore had become a part of us. And whatever happened next didn't matter anymore. Autumn was coming into its own, and every morning greeted us with coolness and fog hovering over the lake. Max began to run out to the water more often, chasing birds, and Ruby stayed closer to home, occasionally going into the woods on her own. One morning, when I was making coffee, Emma came out with a package of letters that someone had planted under the door of the coffee shop. "Letters?" I asked, looking at her in surprise. "Yes." The locals started writing thank you notes and well wishes. Lori said they wanted to make a little tradition of leaving letters with stories or just memories of the city. I opened one of the envelopes. Inside was a sheet with neat handwriting. "I was 12 when my grandfather brought me to this lake. We fished and warmed ourselves by the fire. This coffee shop reminds me of those days. Thank you for creating this place." Emma silently sat down next to me, leaning against me. It seems we had done something more important than we thought. I took her hand and nodded. "Yes. And that's a good thing." The next week, we decided to make a small stand at the entrance where everyone could leave a letter or a memory. Sarah and Lori brought some old wooden boards and together we made something that looked like a mailbox. Max, as always, actively helped. He carried the boards, which Ruby then took away, carefully making sure that none were lost. By the end of the day, the stand was ready. "It looks even better than I imagined," Emma said, dusting off her hands. "Now I wonder how many people will remember this box." Lori laughed. "Trust me, it'll be full in a week." When the first frosts came, the coffee shop became a place for many people to hide from the cold wind, drink hot tea, and sit by the fireplace. Max spent most of his time in the hall, while Ruby lay on the terrace, watching the lake gradually become covered with a thin crust of ice. Emma started baking pies, and a new smell appeared in the coffee shop, one that reminded me of the warmth of home. One evening, as I was closing the door, Emma stopped at the window and looked out at the lake for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, hugging her shoulders. "I just never imagined that I could fall in love with this place so quickly." She turned her head to me and smiled. "It feels like home, doesn't it?" I nodded, and we stayed standing, watching the sun set behind the forest, illuminating the lake with orange light. A new phase was just beginning, and I knew that there would be many more evenings like this ahead. Winter came quickly. The lake froze over, and the forest around the coffee shop was covered with snow. The silence became even deeper and the evenings longer. Max loved to run through the thin layer of snow, leaving footprints behind him, and Ruby, as always, chose a seat closer to the fireplace. The coffee shop was now filled with regular customers. Some were hiding from the cold, others just wanted to drink hot coffee and read a book. One morning, I noticed several people gathered near the letter stand. "What's going on there?" I asked Emma, wiping my cup. Laurie said that someone had left something interesting there. I came closer. In the box was a thick envelope with photos of the old town and the lake. On the back was written, "Places that don't change hold the most stories." I returned to the hall and put the photos on the table by the fireplace. Several guests immediately came over, looking at the black and white pictures with interest. "That's the old pier," an elderly woman said, pointing to one of the photos. "My father worked here when I was a child." Emma smiled. "Maybe this is a sign that we should make an exhibition of old photos of the town." I nodded. "That's a good idea. Let's add some history to our place." For several weeks we collected old photos. People brought pictures of their relatives, old maps, and newspaper clippings. Emma arranged all this in the form of collages on the walls of the coffee shop. The room looked completely different, warmer, closer to the people. One evening, when we were finishing the decorations, Laurie came in with a large photo of the lake, taken before the first building appeared here. "Look," she said, pointing to the shore, "this is the exact spot where your coffee shop stands now." Emma took the photo and looked at it for a long time. "Can you imagine how much this lake has seen?" I looked at Ruby, who was napping under the bar, and Max, who was watching us from the terrace. "I think it will see a lot more." When the first big snow fell, we decided to organize a winter fair by the lake. Emma and Sarah did the organization, and I built wooden benches and small houses for the craftsmen. Max, as usual, was running around, and Ruby was lying in the snow, watching the bustle. When the fair opened, people gathered by the lake. Children were skating, adults were drinking hot mulled wine and laughing around the campfires. Emma stood next to me, holding my hand, and looked at it all with a slight smile. "What's next?" she asked. I looked out at the lake, the ice-covered shore, and our coffee shop, glowing with lights in the snow. "Let's just keep going." The winter fair lasted until the evening. The snow crunched underfoot, the air was filled with the aroma of mulled wine, cinnamon, and fresh pastries that Emma had prepared in the morning. Max ran between the tables, stopping from time to time near children who were happy to throw snowballs at him. Ruby, as usual, kept to herself. She settled down at the entrance to the cafe and quietly watched everything, as if she were guarding the evening. When the sun went down, we lit up the big lanterns along the shore. Their light reflected in the ice, creating a fairy tale atmosphere. Emma came up to me with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Well, Captain, it looks like the fair is a success." I took a cup and looked at the people who continued to walk and laugh despite the cold. "It looks like everyone is happy. And you?" I looked at her as she stood there wrapped in her down jacket, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I was. We stood there, drinking hot chocolate and listening to the children laughing at the ice rink and the fire crackling by the fairgrounds. "It looks like we've created a new tradition," Emma said, leaning against me. "Maybe this will become an annual event. Laurie will love it." When the fair was over, we sat around the fire for a long time, long after everyone had left. Max was sleeping at our feet, and Ruby was curled up on the terrace. Emma looked out at the lake, which sparkled calmly under the starry sky. I never thought it was possible to be happy like this. I put my arms around her shoulders and held her close. "There is something special here. And not just in this place," I said, looking at her. Emma smiled slightly, not answering. The fire was burning down, but we were in no hurry to go inside. It seemed that this winter would last for a long time, but we were not afraid of it. The next morning, the snow was even thicker. Max was the first to run out into the yard, leaving traces that were immediately swept away by the snow gusts. Ruby followed, but after running a few meters, she stopped and went back inside. Winter was clearly not her favorite season. Emma was already in the kitchen, making coffee. She was looking out the window, wrapped in a warm sweater, and looked like she was quite content with this calm morning. "I have a feeling we're not going anywhere today," she said, handing me a cup. "That's not a bad thing. Max seems to think otherwise." I looked at the dog, who had already rolled around in the snow, turning himself into a white ball. "He is always ready for an adventure." Emma smiled. "Maybe we should go to the lake. It will be beautiful there today. And get cold? Let's take a thermos of tea." An hour later we were walking along the forest path that led to the frozen lake. Max ran ahead, looking for branches under the snow, and Ruby was more cautious, staying closer to Emma. When we reached the lake, the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. The ice glistened in the rays, and the trees around us were covered with frost, as if someone had decorated the whole place for the holidays. Emma sat down on a log near the shore and took out a thermos. "It's so quiet," she said, looking at the distant snow-covered shores. "At moments like this, it seems like the world stops." She handed me a cup of hot tea, and we sat there listening to the wind rustle in the treetops. Max ran over, sat down next to me, and laid down with his head on my lap. Ruby stayed by Emma's side, looking at the lake as if she was waiting for something. "Do you think we'll spend another winter here?" Emma asked, leaning slightly toward me. I ran my hand through Max's fur and nodded. "I think we're here for a long time." Emma turned to me and smiled. "I like this." The sun rose higher, and we stayed on the beach, drinking hot tea and enjoying the silence that seemed endless. We didn't have to rush anywhere. Winter kept the town quiet for a few more weeks. The coffee shop remained an island of warmth among the snowdrifts. People came in more often, some just to warm up by the fireplace, some to have coffee and talk. One morning, when I went out on the terrace, I saw Laurie trudging through the snow with a large package in her hands. Max was the first to run to her, jumping around while she tried to push him away with her elbow. "Calm down, Max," she laughed, "I'm not carrying this for you." I opened the door and let her in. "What is this? Do you remember what I said about the exhibition of old photos of the town? People keep bringing in pictures. I thought maybe you and Emma would like to hang some new ones." She put the package on the bar, blowing the snow off her jacket. Emma came out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel. "What's all the fuss?" "Laurie came with presents," I answered, untying the package. Inside were dozens of old photographs. In one picture I saw our lake. Boats, fishermen, a group of children playing on the shore. Everything looked like it was a few decades ago. "It's incredible," Emma whispered as she looked at the photo. "And that's not all." Sarah said that the library's old archives contained letters from local residents from the early 20th century. They could be displayed here, too. Emma looked up, and a familiar light came into her eyes. We can make a whole wall of memory in the coffee shop. I smiled. Looks like we have work to do again. In the evening, when the coffee shop closed, Emma and I started choosing photos for the exhibition. Max laid down by the fireplace, and Ruby, as usual, sat by the door and watched the snow falling outside the window. "Look," Emma said, showing me a photo. It was of a young couple sitting by the same tree where Emma and I used to stop often during our walks along the lake. Can you imagine how many stories like this are hidden here? I put my arm around her shoulders. "We're writing ours." Emma snuggled closer, and I ran my fingers down her arm, looking at the fire. We spent the next few days decorating the memory wall in the coffee shop. Emma hung old photographs in simple wooden frames, and I fixed small signs with stories that people had left in the mailbox underneath. When everything was ready, we stepped back a few steps and looked at the wall. "It looks like this coffee shop has always been here," Emma said, her hands on her hips. "Maybe it has. We just got here at the right time." She turned her head and looked at me with that slight smile she always had when she was really happy. "Do you think this is our place?" I put my arms around her shoulders and nodded. "I think so." Max lay down at the bar, curled up in a ball, and Ruby, as always, sat by the door, staring out into the snowy courtyard. The coffee shop was warm, and the fire in the fireplace was crackling, adding to the coziness. The end of this winter came unexpectedly. One evening, as the sun was setting, Emma and I were sitting by the lake, wrapped in blankets. Max was running around on the thin ice, and Ruby was watching him from the shore, sometimes giving him a little bark, as if to warn him not to go too far. Emma took my hand and looked out at the lake. "Do you think we'll be here much longer?" I squeezed her fingers and smiled. "We're not looking for another place, are we?" She shook her head. "No. It's good here." Max walked back to us, leaving a line of footprints in the snow. "Look," Emma said, pointing to his tracks, "this trail is ours now." Ruby stepped out onto the ice, pawing carefully, and followed Max. I looked at them and realized that this had become a part of our life. The lake, the forest, the coffee shop, and these endless evenings by the fireplace. Nothing else needed to change. We were already at home. Spring came quietly, almost imperceptibly. The snow melted slowly, revealing the paths we had walked in the winter. The lake was free of ice, and Max could now run along the shore for hours, chasing the waves. The coffee shop continued to live its life. Lori brought new photos for the memory wall, and Sarah started to organize evenings with live music. Emma stayed out on the terrace more often, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of coffee, watching the nature change. One evening we were sitting by the lake again. Max and Ruby lay next to each other, feeling the same peaceful silence that filled our every day. Emma leaned closer and put her head on my shoulder. "Have you ever thought that we could stay here forever?" I looked at her and smiled slightly. "I think we have already stayed." She squeezed my hand and nodded silently. The sun was sinking below the horizon, illuminating the lake with a soft golden light. We sat there, taking our